thank you so much for this invitation to give this talk. I'm very excited about this work. This is joint work with Leandro Carvalho, who's also at USC, and Patrick Turley, who's at the Massachusetts General Hospital. And this is pretty much work in progress. So, you know, any ideas you might have, any questions, feel free to ask. I'm an economist, as Mario mentioned, and in economics, we pretty much, the rule is like to, you know, ask questions as the speaker talks. So if you have any questions, you know, I'll be happy to answer them as they come. Or I think I hope we're gonna have some time at the end for some discussion also. So yeah, feel free to ask questions as you go, or to wait until the end. So in this paper, we asked the question about whether education is the great equalizer. In particular, we're going to be looking at a compulsory schooling reform. And we're going to ask whether this compulsory schooling reform affected the relationship between at-birth disadvantages and later life socioeconomic status, or SES. And there is, for some reason, there is this idea that many people have that education is a great equalizer, and education policy is a way to reduce poverty, to reduce inequality, and to improve socioeconomic mobility. And I've added here two quotes that give you kind of this idea. One, the first one by Horace Mann, a pioneer in American education, says that education then, beyond all other devices of human origin, is a great equalizer of the conditions of men, the balance wheel of the social machinery. And the second one, much more recent, by the US Secretary of Education in the Obama era, says, you know, in America, education is still the great equalizer. So in this work, we're looking for empirical evidence of whether education is the great equalizer. We're gonna, in particular, ask whether education can reduce differences in socioeconomic status in life by groups defined by two measures of initial endowments: genetics and birthplace. So why genetics and birthplace? Well, genetics and birthplace are very related to socioeconomic status towards life, where you're born, and the kind of genetics you inherit from your parents. So there is a number of very influential papers by Chetty and co-authors that show that the neighborhoods where children are born and grow up predict their later life SES. So if you're born in a neighborhood with less poverty, less inequality, better schools, that's gonna have an effect on your earnings, whether you go to college, your fertility, your marriage patterns, you know, but pretty much everything that has to do with SES is related to the characteristics form of where you're born. And these effects, interestingly, are actually larger for children coming from poor families. So if you come from a poor family, the impact of the neighborhood, the quality of the neighborhood where you're born, is actually larger than if you come from a rich family. And in addition to this neighborhood influence, genetics is also associated with SES. There's been a number of recent large-scale genetic association analysis of education and attainment that shows that a polygenic score, that is a score that, you know, that kind of linearly predicts the effect of genetics on education, can predict up to 13% of the variation in educational attainment. So in this paper, we're asking, you know, is education the great equalizer, right? In a world where these initial endowments, such as where you're born, and your genetics matter, can education level the playing field and equalize opportunities of economic success? Well, theoretically, it's not clear what this effect is going to be, right? On one hand, education might compensate for individual disadvantages. There might be diminishing returns in the production of socioeconomic status, meaning that if you already have, come from a better than average neighborhood, more education is not gonna benefit you that much. So these two first explanations would suggest that, yeah, education can act as an equalizer. However, on the other hand, there might be like higher returns to education, meaning that education might increase wages more for those in neighborhoods with more economic opportunities or with better schools, right? We know that it's not only the quantity of schooling that matters, but also the quality of schooling that matters. Or, there might be like smarter people or people with certain types of skills might benefit more from a given amount of education. So it is really a kind of an empirical matter, and we're gonna try to shed some light with data on this question. So what do we do in this paper? We use compulsory schooling reform as a natural experiment. So we call it a natural experiment in economics, meaning that we're gonna use a compulsory schooling reform to get at some variation in schooling that it's not chosen by individuals. So why is this important, right? So I'm interested in the causal question, right? What's the causal effect of on SES or wages, and how does this effect vary by people's initial endowments, by people's birthplace, by people's genetics? And simply correlating education with, say, wages in midlife, it's not going to get us this answer, because both education and wages might be affected by many things, such as your parental background, the type of family you were raised. So in economics, very usually we try to look at natural experiments where we can get a change in education that's not related to choices, that's not related to these other outcomes that might confound these relationships. So that's how we're going to be using the compulsory schooling reform here. So it's interesting because compulsory schooling laws are very common around the world. Most of the countries in the world, they regulate the age at which kids must enter school and the age until which kids must remain in school. So we are going to study the 1972 raising of school leaving age in the UK, or ROSLA. So this reform was very interesting because it raised the age at which kids could drop out at school from 15 to 16 years of age. And the reason why it's a natural experiment is because it raised this age only for people who were born on September 1st, 1957 or after that. So kids who were born until August 31st could still drop out at age 15. And then kids who were born after that, they had to stay in school until age 16. So what I'm going to show you is that this can generate a discontinuity between your date of birth and your level of schooling. And we are going to exploit the discontinuity in what economists call a regression discontinuity design to get at the causal effects of education on wages. And I'm going to give you more details in a bit. So we're going to show that this reform increased schooling and wages.
Dr. Barcellos.
Sure.
Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Just a question there. This program was made in the whole UK?
Yeah, not the whole UK. It was England, Wales, and Scotland.
Okay, and then so there is no comparative group in this case, just historic groups.
explain what the comparative group is going to be. Basically, the comparative group is going to be the who were born, you know, before this, it's going to be a cohort, right, effect. The group who was born up to August 30th is going to be the comparative, the comparison group to the kids who were born September 1st.
Okay, thank you.
In more details about the methodology. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, so feel free to, I know this is, I might use a lot of like economics jargon, so feel free to, whenever there's something that's not clear, feel free to interrupt. So we're looking at this reform, we're gonna show that this reform increased schooling, increased wages in midlife, and then we're gonna ask, is this increase in wages different for those with different initial endowments, right? In particular, we're gonna re-estimate the effects of this schooling reform depending on the quality of your place of birth, of your neighborhood of birth, and your genetic your individual genetic predisposition to educational attainment. Why are these interesting? These are both interesting because as proxies of endowment, because they are determined at birth and strongly associated with later life outcomes, as you know, I mentioned in my motivation, but I'm also going to show within my data that these two, place of birth and genetics, are going to be associated with your wages, and of course they don't change with your, as you leave, right? So our main question is going to be, does education affect this strong association between these initial endowments and socioeconomic status? And does it, in particular, does it reinforces or does it mitigate this association? So just to give you kind of a preview of our results, unfortunately, we find no evidence that education, at least in this very particular context of a compulsory schooling reform, we have no evidence that it is a great equalizer. We do show that the compulsory schooling reform reduced differences in educational attainment by these endowment groups. However, it increased differences in log wages by endowments. So if anything, we see a reinforcing of this very strong association between education and endowments. So the widening of this gap was even larger among compliers, which what we call compliers are the people who were affected by this compulsory schooling reform. That is those who were leaving school at age 15 before the reform took place. And the difference, just to give you an idea, the difference between those at the top tercile of the endowment distribution in terms of returns, it's 5 to 7 log points than compared to those at the bottom tercile of the endowment distribution. So it's quite a big difference between the returns to schooling at the top and at the bottom. And interestingly, these results are pretty similar independently of whether we use the genetics, the place of birth, or both as a measure of endowment. So, you know, now that you know what we found, I'm gonna show you how we got there. So starting with the data, we're gonna use data from the UK Biobank, which is a very large cohort initiated by the National Health Services in the UK. Between 2006 and 2010, they interviewed 500,000, they interviewed and actually assessed the health of 500,000 individuals between ages 40 and 69. So it's important to note here that the data was collected about 34 to 38 years after the introduction of the 1972 ROSLA, the compulsory schooling reform that we are gonna study. So everything that I'm gonna show you here are really kind of the effects of secondary schooling on socioeconomic status 30 to 35 years later. So, you know, very large gap. In terms of the good things, the positive sides of this data set is that it has exact date of birth. It has the day, month, and year of birth. So to estimate the type of regression discontinuity models that I'm gonna estimate here, that's very important. It also has fully genotyped the whole cohort, the whole 500,000 individuals, so we can calculate this polygenic scores. And it also has approximate coordinates of birth, so we can link historical data on neighborhood SES around the time of birth. So we're gonna have, you know, the average education level, the average occupation SES, the average mortality rates for the neighborhoods that you're born at the time when you were born. So that's our neighborhood. That's going to be our neighborhood measure of quality. On the negative side, on the con side, this data set is not nationally representative. In particular, it's been shown that the participants of the UK Biobank were more educated than the average UK population. And it also has some pretty crude socioeconomic status measures. So we're gonna do something to get around, and I'm gonna explain how we're gonna get our SES measure in the next slide. So we start with 500,000 individuals, and we restrict the sample. We do some restrictions first. We restrict the sample to European ancestry participants. That's because of the polygenic score has been shown to only predict outcomes well in this European ancestry population. We're also gonna restrict the sample to those born in England, Scotland, and Wales between September 1st, 47 and August 31st, 1967. So, you know, England, Scotland, and Wales were the ones who were affected by the compulsory schooling reform. And we are going to look at those at people born years of the reform, of when the reform took place. And importantly, our last restriction is going to be, we're going to restrict to people who report having left school at age 18 or younger. And this last restriction is important because of a data limitation. So the UK Biobank don't ask date when you left school if you went to college. So we don't have that information. But we don't think that's a big problem because we've shown... So, sorry, go ahead. Are there any questions? No? Okay. I thought I heard a question. Never mind. So we don't think that's a big issue because we've shown in our data, and other papers have shown in their data, that the reform, by requesting that students stay in school until age 16, they don't suddenly go to college. We see that most of the effect is that students are going to stay until age 16. Students who were out at age 15 are going to stay until age 16. A few students stay until age 17 and 18, but the proportion is much smaller. And we don't see anything above age 18. So we believe we're pretty safe with restricting the sample that way. So once we add all these restrictions, we have a final sample of about 100,000 participants. So I mentioned that our measures of socioeconomic status are not ideal. The best measure we have, so for example, things like income, we only have income for the household and in brackets. So we don't have a lot of variation. It's not a very granular income variable. So the best SES outcome we have is actually occupation. In a verbal interview, respondents reported their occupation, and the answers were coded in over 400 categories. So what we do is to then get these categories and match with median wages for each occupation based on the 2009 annual service of hours and earnings, or ASH. We know we do this gender specific, calculated among like full-time employments, and it includes all labor earnings. So this is gonna be our main outcome measure in this paper. And I'm gonna refer this to, this occupation-based wages simply as wages, just to simplify.
Doctor, just to be sure that I understand well the design that you have. So you had two groups then. One group for 1972, and this another from Wales, from England, and from Scotland. Ireland was out, right?
Right.
Yeah, and then you have another group from 1945, 47. That's correct?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, 30 years apart.
I'm gonna show you exactly. Okay. We're gonna be controlling for cohort trends. So we're gonna, what's that discontinuity on the people born right before the September 1st, 1957 threshold and right after.
Okay, so, but he's correct, the design, right? These two groups, and then the questionnaire was done in the same period for both of them.
Yes, the questionnaire, was done. We have it's done for everything.
Okay, thank you.
So just to give you kind of like just an idea that our kind of main outcome makes sense. So this is our main, like a plot of the cumulative distribution of our main outcome, this occupation-based based on the reported household income. And as you can explain, and as you can expect, the log wages for people who report lower income is going to be to the left of the log wages of people who report higher income. So this is kind of just a sanity check that our main outcomes make sense given the household incomes reported by the participants. So now I'm going to get to the exact type of method that we're going to use, or the reform that we're going to study, and the method. So as I mentioned, in 1972, England, Scotland, and Wales raised their minimum school leaving age from 15 to 16. And the policy only affected students born on September 1st, 57 or after. So students born up to August 31st or before could still drop out at age 15. So as a result, the students born within days of each other, who would otherwise have similar education and SES, ended up with with differences in schooling. So here's kind of how a graph that shows you these differences. So I plot here the school leaving age, average school leaving age by year of birth. And the 0 here is the people who were born, up to like from September 1st, 57 to September 1st to August 31st, 58. So it's kind of the first cohort affected by the policy. And what you can see here is that even though education was still going up for these cohorts before the policy, there is a discontinuous jump on the first cohort affected by the policy. So this is kind of what we're gonna, as I was explaining, this is kind of what we're gonna be using, in the regression discontinuity designs. We're gonna be comparing the outcomes of those before the threshold to the outcomes of those after the threshold. And it assumes the main assumption behind this design is that they are comparable, except that the people on the right side was affected by the reform and got the extra education. So
Dr. Barcellos, I have a question. This is Gladys Maestre. So the age of leaving the school was changed because the school, they have more years of education, or because they entered school earlier? I'm sorry if this is too basic, but...
They stay in school until later.
Say that again, I'm sorry.
They stay, so as I mentioned, countries usually regulate both. They regulate the age at which students must enter and the age at which students must stay in school, or the age at which they can drop out of school. So this specific reform changed the end date, the date at which kids could drop out.
So they added 1 year of education. So it's actually number of years at school.
Yes.
Yes.
So the school age as number of years at school. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you well.
You can't hear me well? Sorry.
Okay, so it was actually 1 year more of going to school?
Yes, 1 more year of education. Mm-hmm.
And this imply 12 years or 11 years of education?
So it's less because they are, it's probably like from 9 to 10 years of education. So it's
okay. Okay, thank you.
like 12 years would be until age 18. Yeah, it's 12 years. So, okay. Otherwise, can you hear me as I present or no? Yeah? Okay. So tell me if you can hear me. So the main identifying assumption is, so then kind of we're trying to use this discontinuity to get at the causal effect of educations on outcomes later in life, right? So what we're going to be doing is that we're going to be looking at this date of birth profile of a number of like our main outcome, wages, and then we're going to ask, are the people, when we go back to these people when they are age 55, are the people who were born, before this threshold earning less than the people who were born after, discontinuously, right? And then we're going to say, if there is a discontinuity there, then this is going to be the causal effect of education on earnings. Well, the main identifying assumption behind this method is that people on either side of the threshold are on average similar, except for the extra education. And while this assumption cannot be fully tested, we can look at the characteristics that are predetermined, and we can ask, are these predetermined characteristics move across this threshold? And this is where kind of the genetic data becomes very useful in supporting this evidence, because genetic data, it's going to be objective, it's going to be determined at conception, and it's not going to change in life. So what we do then is that we're going to, we look at this date of year of birth profiles of a number of genetic markers, such as the BMI polygenic score, the EA polygenic scores, and the principal components of the genetic matrix. And we basically show that we see no discontinuities at the threshold of the policy, right? So we look at a bunch of things that are predetermined, and we see basically no discontinuities. So this gives us some confidence that when we, that the people who were born before this this threshold that was, picked at random is not different, from the people who were after. So that our natural experience is best. The other possible problematic thing could be whether, participants, we saw that the participants to the left, to the right of the reform of the threshold are more educated, right? Get more secondary education. And it could be that this extra education affected their probability of participating in the survey in the UK Biobank, which would be problematic for our purposes. So what we do in this graph is that we plot the density of respondents by day of birth. And again, 0 marks the September 1st, 1957 cohort. And we can basically kind of show that from, the 47 to 67, there is some variation, there is some trend, but there is no discontinuity. It's not the case that, the cohort that got the extra education were more likely to participate in the survey. Okay, so since we we look at this two evidence, as evidence that the regression discontinuity design is indeed valid. So we then look at, okay, so what do we see a discontinuity in wages? So here, instead of education, I plot wages measured when these people were, 55 years old, more or less. And what we can see again with education, we see that for, this is quarter of birth, we see that before the reform took place, wages were rising together with the average level of education. But what's interesting to us is that there is this discontinuity. And we're going to say that, this effect is going to be the effect of that discontinuity on education on wages, or in other words, the returns to education in terms of wages. Right? So
Doctor, you just to understand well in the back. Okay, you took the principal component for ancestry, that the genetics that you used?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yes, okay, was ancestry what you used to use the principal components, and you didn't find, okay, there is no differences, there is no discontinuity along to the principal components, correct?
That's correct.
Okay,
yeah.
okay, fine. Just to be sure that I am grasping what you are saying. Okay, thank you.
Because that's a very nice predetermined characteristic, right? Objective.
Yep.
It's a nice way to show that there's no random difference across our control and our treatment.
Yeah, thank you.
In this table, I'm just going to show you some estimates on a regression form of the graphs that I just showed you. So what I call first stage here is the effect of being born after the reform on school living age or education, as Gladys mentioned. And what we find is that the reform, that discontinuity that I showed you, it's about a third of a year. So by asking that students stay until age 16, on average among the whole population, the UK increased education by a third of a year in this cohort. Because there were, even though the reform applied to everyone, a lot of people were staying until after age 16 anyway. So that's why this effect is not equal to 1 year, right? And then when we ask about, okay, what's the effect then of this extra education on log wages? Well, we show that, again, being born after the reform, the people around the whole population had had wages that were about 1.8% larger. So, 1/3 of a year, people on average had about 1.8 higher wages.
Dr. Barcellos, let me ask you something. So how did you define wages?
So the wages were those measures that I mentioned. We got the occupations that people,
Mm-hmm.
400 categories of occupations. And we got another national data set of the UK, and we asked for each occupation, what's the median wage by gender for full-time employers in that occupation.
So was the compensation for the occupation at the time of the interview? And this was considering the whole life wages, or just like 1 year, or currently monthly, or?
So one point in time in midlife. So these people were, they were born in 57. So in 2006, they were about 50 something.
Okay.
Interviewed between 2006 and 2010. So they were between 50 and 55 years, more or less.
Okay, thank you.
So this is the effect of an increase in secondary, thank you for clarifying. This is an effect of an increase in secondary education when they are 15, 16, on their wages when they are 50. Okay? So then, okay, so what I showed you so far is that, oh, okay, I need to go back. Sorry. what I showed you so far is that, we're going to study this reform, and this reform had an effect on education and wages. But what we're really interested in this paper is whether this effect was different, right? For people with different initial endowments. As I mentioned, we have this world where, it matters where you start for how well you're going to do in life. So the question we're interested is, can education or education policy level this playing field? Can it kind of help us, break the cycle between, where you're in which the background in which you're born and how successful you are. So as I mentioned, we're going to look at two types of heterogeneity. One is genetics, and one is the quality of the place where you're born. So for the genetic heterogeneity, we're going to look at a polygenic score for educational attainment. And some of you might know this better than I do, but but some of you might not. So I'm going to go through a quick explanation of what this polygenic score is. It's basically, we're going to get the individual level data, genetic data in the UK Biobank, and we're going to calculate a weighted average of a person's genotype. So here, S is going to be the EA polygenic score for individual I, and that's going to be a weighted average of the person's genotype at SNP J. So SNPs are parts of the genome where, we're different from one another. So it's basically kind of the number of minor alleles is J. It's kind of the type of genetic marker you have at that SNP. And we're going to have a weight assigned to each one of these SNPs, J. And these weights are going to come from genome-wide association studies that are not, they're not include our analytical sample, right? So what is genome-wide association studies are basically kind of large genetic associations, studies that kind of map, get your whole genotype and ask, for each part of your genome, what's the association with a given outcome of interest, in our case, education. So we're gonna get in this GWAS, we're gonna get, this SNP J is associated with this strength with education, so we're gonna then plot that weight there and then calculate for our using individual level data in the UK Biobank for each individual polygenic score. So
Barcellos, do you include the principal components ancestry in the analysis, or you didn't?
Yeah, we do. Interestingly, they don't make much of a difference when we include them, which suggests that the reform, the type of effects we're gonna be showing are not very driven by ancestry.
Right, but the idea is because there is the possibility of population stratification related to the wage of the people according to the social economical class.
For sure. Yeah.
Then a way to avoid that bias using the principal component for ancestry. So you didn't use it because you believe that there is no related with that. How did you cope with the population stratification if it still exists in this case?
Yeah, we do in the paper. We the results I'm going to show you here, they do control for the principal components. The only thing that I was mentioning is that we also, because we thought it was interesting because of this, we wanted to know how much of this effect is driven by stratification. So we also ran a series of analysis about these principal components. And I thought it was interesting that the results are not that different. My prior would be that they would be different, but they weren't that different. So that's the only thing. Yeah, but we do. Everything that I'm going to show you here today include the principal components.
Okay, thank you.
So the polygenic scores that we're going to use, you know, as I mentioned, explain 12 to 13% of this variation in educational attainment. But as you know, as Professor Alvarenga was already hinting at, we need care when interpret these polygenic score results, right? First, they are association only. You know, they should not be interpreted as the causal effects of genetics on education. They're not capturing exclusively direct genetic effects. They're actually capturing a number of different pathways. One is population stratification, as Professor Alvarenga was mentioning. You know, there is been shown that population stratification is an issue when using genetic and these polygenic scores. And the way to deal with that is to control for the first principal components of the genetic matrix. And we do that in our analysis. The second one is this genetic nurturing, this intergenerational effects, right? You know, you can think of like your parents' background as being an omitted variable here, right? Your parents' background is going to be affected by your parents' genetics. Your parents' genetics are going to affect, you know, what your genetics is going to be, but also their outcomes. And their outcomes, such as their educational level, are going to affect your educational level, right? So there's this very interesting paper by Kong and al. That show that even the genes that were not transmitted to you from your parents, right? So here's the genes from your father, the genes from your mother. There's some of them that are transmitted to you, and some of them they're not transmitted to you. And using a data set that has the genotype of both parents and children, they show that even the genes that are not transmitted to children by their parents affect children outcomes. And they call that the genetic nurturing path, right? There is, you know, an effect, say, of your parents' genes on their level of education, and their level of education are gonna be affecting your level of education. So in addition to this direct genetic effect, there is also this genetic nurturing path. And they calculate that about half of the variance accounted by the EA polygenic score can be explained by this genetic nurturing effect. So that's kind of important when we think about the PGS results. You know, so this slide is just to say, you know, these scores reflect many things. Among them, some cognitive, non-cognitive skills. But these effects are, you know, we shouldn't be thinking only about individual skills or cognitive or non-cognitive skills. We should be thinking about many types of channels when we do this analysis by polygenic score, including this parental background effects. That said, you know, when we look at our data and we correlate the EA polygenic score with log wages, we see that it's highly correlated, right? It's correlated and it's very significant. This is the, you know, this line is kind of a correlation. This is the coefficient, the standard error, and the p-value. So you can see that, you know, your genetics are really highly predictive of your SES later in life. And this is just kind of some numbers. For the whole sample, a 1 standard deviation increase in your polygenic score increases your weight, like it's associated with an increased wages of 2.7% increased wages. So this is kind of our measure of genetic heterogeneity. When we're gonna ask here, does this increase in education because of this compulsory schooling law, does it reinforce or does it mitigate this very strong relation between genetics and wages and socioeconomic status later in life? Then I'm just gonna talk a little bit about our other measure of heterogeneity, which is the neighborhood SES. As I mentioned, we use this approximate coordinates of birth to match to historical data on the local authority level in 1961. SES. So we're going to ask, we're going to have measures of the quality of the neighborhood where individuals were born around the time when they were born. So today I'm going to show you results on the average, on the fraction of people staying in school until age 15, which in the paper we show that it captures a lot of the potential neighborhood variation at this level of education, at the level of the neighborhood or this local authority levels in the US. So just to give you an idea, there are in each of these neighborhoods, there are about 39,000 people on average, and with a median of 19,000. So this is the kind of neighborhood we're going to be looking at. And again, we relate this log wages to these neighborhood measures, and we see like a positive relation. If you're born in a neighborhood that is more educated, you end up with higher wages later in life. It's not as strong as the polygynic score, but it's still, significant for the whole sample. One standard deviation increase in the average education at the time when you're born, at the neighborhood where you're born, is related to about 1.8% higher wages. So again, these are like strong correlations that, in a sense, perpetuate, right, inequality and poverty, right? If you're born in a less advantaged family, in a less advantaged neighborhood, then you're more likely to be worse off in your 50s. So that's, our question is how does education play with this challenge, with this inequality, right? And I'm gonna start by looking at the effects on education, right? The stats on average school leaving age. I'm showing you here a similar graph as I showed you in the beginning, average school leaving age by year of birth, with the difference that now I break by EA polygynic score tercile. So the squares are those at the top tercile of the polygynic score, the triangles are the median, and the circles are below. And what I show here is that the reform affected the three groups. However, the jump is much higher for the low group than for the high group, right? So in a sense, this reform did, if you look at kind of the difference between the three curves in education, the difference is larger to the left of the threshold than to the right of the threshold, meaning that the compulsory schooling reform did compress differences in educational attainment. And this was mostly because this is the same graph, but instead of school leaving age is the fraction leaving school at age 16. It's basically because, and because of the compression in the fraction of people who were dropping out at before age 16, right, at age 15. So you can see here that those with the low polygynic score were much less likely to stay until age 16 before the reform than those at the medium and top terciles of the polygynic score. And then once the reform hits, this difference disappears, right? Because now everyone is required by law to stay in school until age 16. So it is true that the reform is compressing differences in education, right? And we see a similar story when we break by terciles of the neighborhood education variable, right? Instead of the genetic variable. We see that, the jump for those from low education neighborhoods is higher than those for high education neighborhoods. And again, that the fraction leaving school at age 16 was lower for those from low education neighborhoods than those from high education. And then that the reform closes this gap in a sense. And that's where the closing of the gap in the education differences come from. So again, this is just kind of a regression form of the type of analysis that I just showed you. So as I showed you before, the being born after the reform means that you stay in school for about a third of a year later. So this is this last line here, the post variable. What we show here is that the interaction between the post and the PGS is negative, meaning that those with higher polygenic scores were less affected by the reform. Because again, they were more likely to stay in school until age 16 anyway. And the same thing for those coming from more educated neighborhoods, being born in more educated neighborhoods. They were also less likely to be affected by the reform. And what's interesting here is that when we add both interactions in the same model, we see that they are both significant and the size of the effect don't really change. Meaning that kind of the heterogeneity on the genetics and the heterogeneity on the place of birth are seem to be working into independent channels, right? So now we finally are ready to get to the, I've been talking for about an hour, so now we're finally ready to get at the main question we are interested in, right? We see this compression in education. Do we see a compression in wages in midlife, right? So we're gonna have a regression where we regress log wages on the score, on the polygenic score, on the school leaving age, which is our measure of education, and on this cohort trends. And we are gonna have the interaction between school leaving age and the score. And the polygenic score regression, this first regression, are also gonna include, as I mentioned, are gonna include the principal components to correct for stratification. And we're gonna do the same thing with the education variable, the place of birth variable. We're gonna ask, does the effect of the schooling vary depending on the type of neighborhood you get? And we're gonna instrument education or school leaving age with an indicator of whether you were born before or after the reform, okay? And I'm gonna show you these results kind of this continuous empirical strategy graphically in the form of a line. In addition to this continuous strategy, I'm also gonna show you some results for a discrete strategy where instead of using the discrete polygenic score or the discrete measure of neighborhood quality, I'm gonna break these measures into terciles, and I'm gonna interact the school leaving age or the education variable with the bottom, the middle, and the top terciles. And I'm gonna ask, are the effects for the bottom terciles different from the mid and the top terciles, right? Asking, which part of the endowment distribution benefits the most from this education. So this is what we call the reduced form effects, or the effects on the whole population. And the line is the continuous regression, right? And the bars come from the tercile regressions. So what we can see here is, this is the standardized EA polygenic score on the x-axis and log wages on the y-axis. What's interesting here is that we show even though we saw that the reform increased education for those in the bottom tercile the most, we see that it's those at the top tercile of the EA polygenic score is where we see the largest effect on wages, right? So this is a coefficient of that continuous interaction, the standard errors and the p-values. So we see a very positive interaction on this gradient, meaning that those in the top terciles were the ones who benefited the most from the policy. If we do the same thing by neighborhood, we see a similar thing. Even though the terciles are not monotonic anymore, they're not as clear, we still see a positive line, and this positive line is still significant. You know, the p-values is 0.04, meaning that the effects of the extra education, the compulsory schooling reform, were larger in terms of wages. You know, were larger for those from the better neighborhoods. Now I'm going to present the results that I call like the two-stage least squares results, and in these results we basically rescale the reduced form results with the change in education for each one of the groups, right? And we saw that basically this group got the lowest tercile group got the most education, then the top tercile. So we're gonna rescale, and and this is kind of the returns to education, right? What's the returns to education of one extra year of education in terms of wages? So what this is saying is that while this extra year of education translated into about 3% higher wages for the low terciles, it translated into almost 9% higher wages for the top terciles. And a difference that it's, again, highly statistically significant, right? So meaning that, again, it seems like, you know, even though there was a compression in education, there was, if anything, dispersion in wages because of the compulsory schooling. And we see a similar story if we do the neighborhood certification. So this is just kind of, again, the you know, the regression results for the graphs that I showed you. So again, education instrumented by the reform has a large effects on wages, about 5%, but these effects are even larger for those with higher polygenic score. So one standard deviation increase in the polygenic score increases this effect on wages by about 2.8%. We see a similar thing when we do the regional education, our measure of birthplace quality. And interestingly, when we do we put both simultaneously in the same regression. They're both kind of like a similar magnitude, and they're both independently significant. So I have a few more slides, but I would rather just wrap up so that we have some time for discussion. So I'm just gonna go through a brief summary and some concluding remarks, and it would be great if we could have a discussion afterwards. So what have we shown? So first, we have shown with our data that both genetics and neighborhood like birthplace quality, or the average education of your birthplace at the time of your birth, are very associated with later life occupation-based wages, right? A one standard deviation increase in the polygenic score increases on average 2.7% your wages. A one standard deviation increase in neighborhood education is associated with an increase of about 1.8% in wages in your 50s. We show that then when we have this compulsory schooling reform, it reduced genetic and neighborhood differences in education. You know, it was those with relatively low polygenic scores and those from relatively worse off neighborhoods who were dropping off from school at age 15. So they were the ones most affected by the compulsory schooling reform. However, when we look at the effects on wages, which is kind of our main interest, that we don't see this compression in wages. We see, if anything, that the largest effect of education on wages were for those with high polygenic scores and for those from better neighborhoods. So in the top PGS tercile, 1 extra year of education increases wages by 9 to 11%, while in the bottom tercile of genetics, it increased only by 3 to 5%. So if anything, education, this compulsory schooling reform increased this already very strong association between wages, between your at-birth endowment and your wages in midlife. So what can we conclude from this work? You know, as I said, these compulsory schooling reforms are very common around the globe. That's usually the first type of educational reform that countries do when they want to raise the overall level of education of their populations. And at least in the case of the UK, despite significantly equalizing differences in educational attainment, this compulsory schooling reform fell short of equalizing differences in later life SES, in later life wages. Within our sample, if anything, we see an increased difference in mob wages. And we've been now trying to open this black box and try to ask why. Some possible reasons are school quality, right? People from better neighborhoods, people from families with more higher genetic predisposition for education might have their children enroll in better schools, and that's why this return might be higher. These people might have higher cognitive or non-cognitive skills, which translate into also higher returns, or they might pursue further qualifications, right? So we have some evidence in the data that those with higher polygenic scores don't just stay until age 16. They go on after the reform and stay until age 17, age 18, and they're more likely to do O levels and A levels, which are exams that are valued in the labor market. So they might just be reacting to this compulsory schooling reform differently. The other thing that we've been doing that I'm very excited about is that we have about 20,000 pairs of siblings in the UK Biobank, about 40,000 siblings. So we're trying to use the siblings to decompose the polygenic score results, meaning that, siblings are, they are exposed to a lot of the same family level and geographical level factors. So if we see the same type of interactions within siblings, we can rule out a lot of these possible reasons that I've talked about today. We can learn more about the types of channels that might be driving these results. And then I just want to wrap up with just the caveat that this is a very specific context. This is a one country, the UK, so it's a 3-country context. It's about compulsory schooling. There might be other educational policies out there that are better at being an equalizer. But I think it's going to be going forward interesting to see if our results are generalizable, and if there are other types of education policies that are better at closing these gaps. So I'm gonna leave it at that, and I'll be glad to answer any questions you might have or hear any suggestions. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Barcellos. It's a great presentation. I think we learned a lot. And now I'd like to open it up to any questions from the group. We have 30 people connected, so you can unmute your microphone and ask the question, or if you want to type it in the chat, I can read it out, whatever works for you all. So I'll open it up to questions. Andreas, yes.
Yes, hello, Dr. Barcellos. Obrigado. Tá bom, tá bom. So I have a lot of ideas now. First of all, we have a project that looks at resilience in communities. And Dr. Messer can tell you more about one of the components you may want to see is how in your neighborhoods, in your rich and well-to-do and not so well-to-do, what the street views look like. So street views of the well-to-do and not so well-to-do. And also I think it would be important to perhaps think about that the UK has a very stratified society with a lot of high costs for higher education. It would be interesting how your studies map out in countries like Mexico, where you have peppercorn fees for universities. And on the same rubric, you also want to check maybe how your study maps out when you don't look at the 15 to 16, but to 17 or 18 to 19, because then you canvas much more longitudinal projections. So wonderful study, I think, great.
Thank you, thank you. No, I totally agree. I think I like the idea to do the street view. I even think it would be a nice addition to the, to the slides, to have a street view of the, the different types of buildings. That's a good idea. And yeah, I think it is. I think when I talk about like generalizability, I think I'm right. That I think it would be interesting to see in other societies that might be less or even more stratified than the British society, if we see kind of a similar pattern, and also in other levels of education. I would love to type of natural experiment at the university, right? I know that the youth has increased very quickly. The number of people in university in a short number of, basically the extended in a very short, in a decade, basically. So I was kind of very interested in looking at that and seeing how, in a sense, the compulsory schooling policy is a type of policy that it's usually at the secondary level, and it's usually a policy that restricts choice, right? It makes people stay longer in school. While like policy at the university levels are usually policies that improve, like increase choice, right? You're usually addressing barriers to trying to get more people to have access to university. So this is a very different type of policy. And I would love to see how this type of analysis varies with very different types of policies. So I think I agree with everything.
So, Dr. Barcellos, this is Gladys Maestre. So, as Dr. Holzenberg was saying, we are assessing the streets for social disorder in the Valley and in other cities. We actually included Belo Horizonte Mexico City, Madrid, and we want to include other cities in Latin America. And we are trying to design really how to differentiate what is individual vulnerability versus neighborhood vulnerability. So your presentation made me think about that we need to know not only residential history, but birthplace. We already have from many of our, we have a cohort that has whole genome sequencing, not only GWAS. And in this population, we have 95% of Hispanics. So, and the poverty rates are very high. There are a lot of new neighborhoods. And so I'm wonder what your, I know you say clear and loud that we cannot generalize from this data, but migration is a very important issue here, and I'm wondering what your take is on that, considering birth of place and the education that people had when they were kids. And the second point I would like you to comment on is on the role of family in later life economical attainment. I mean, it seems like that, like particularly for Hispanics, where familism is a big issue. I'm wondering how this may enrich our study. What would your perspective will be?
So I think
Could you speak louder, please? Sorry.
I think those are two good points. Yeah, I'm interested to hearing also. I have some quite, as I'm interested to hearing about how how you're going to use the genetic data how you plan to use the genetic data for Hispanics, because you know that it's so important now to expand this type of analysis for other ancestry groups, including Hispanics, because
I never thought of looking at these aspects. We thought of looking at genetics for cognitive decline and to prediction of diseases, basically, but not for economic attainment or anything like that.
I think it's great collecting this data, because we need more data with Hispanics and genetic data for Hispanics, so we can learn more. I think for the migration, you make a great point, and that's something we've been thinking of exploring also, because one explanation for the results that I showed you here, it might be that the people from the better endowments, right, more better outcomes, better initial outcomes, that in the top percentile of scores, they might attain higher wages because they migrate to better places, right? And we actually have the data with it. We have not only the coordinates of where they were born, but also the coordinates of where they live now. So we were thinking of looking at this issue and ask, are the people from these groups where we see the higher returns to education, are they migrating from relatively worse places to better places? And that's how they're getting this mobility. So I think that's a very interesting hypothesis, and something we wanna look at. you know, how is this migration, how are the migration patterns different for people from these different groups, right? And the other point on family, I also think it's very important. And the way we've been thinking of getting at that is again by using the siblings data, right? Because we have like this 40,000 siblings in the data, and the siblings are all important. You know, they're all subject to the same family dynamics, the family connections. So we were hoping that by using siblings, we can get at least a little bit at how much of the effects that we're seeing are due to family level characteristics, such as like how connected your family is, or preferences for the quality of education, right? How, you know, are you a family that cares and pushes for very high, you know, pays for high quality education? So I think those are very important. And I'll be interested to hearing more about the kind of questions you guys are looking at.
Thank you. In particular, I will say that I see the role of familism when we talk about the kids' enrollment of the children at the college, and how they, if they have the support of their family, they do better. That's for sure. And how does this influence the economic attainment later in life? And also how this is a buffer for stress, you know, which eventually might influence cognitive decline later in life.
Right. Yeah,
So,
there's a literature that shows that upward mobility is stressful, right? Maybe a high achiever coming from a low background and becoming a high achiever is stressful and has consequences for your health. So yeah, so I think
We couldn't hear you.
you can't hear me? That's not good.
Now it's better.
Okay.
Yeah, it's also important if you look at genetics as disposition, what the expression levels are. And, you know, stress levels change methylation patterns and they change expression patterns.
Right.
So there may be much more in it than the sequence.
Right. No, I totally agree. And this is an area I'm already new. I'm an economist by training. I'm already new to this work with this is the third paper I write with genetic data. So I'm learning, but
Good.
I feel that there's a lot to it, and there's so many new development with like epigenetics and all the yeah, it's a field that has been moving with so much speed that it's hard to even follow it. But I agree, there's a lot. I think there are many interesting questions in this. And I'm very interested in the interaction between the, you know, social sciences and genetics in general. So.
Dr. Barcellos, I was wondering I don't know if maybe this is something you've looked at or maybe you're familiar with it in the literature. In neighborhoods where you have a more mixed community, people of different SES background, do you predict, or I mean, do you have any, I hope maybe you've thought about this, but I don't know if you have enough, you know, data from a community like that to compare it to high SES and low SES. Because in the United States, it seems to be, people talk about, you know, the disparities, and that's clearly true. Some people live in high SES neighborhoods, others in low SES, but there are some communities that probably are more mixed. And I'm curious if you've explored that or thought about that or have any comments about that.
That's an interesting question. I have to say that I hadn't thought about it. In some of the data, the historical data, so basically I think if I understand what you're saying, instead of like using average education as we've been using, you're suggesting, what about if you look at like the variance of education, right? Like whether, you know, is a neighborhood, are children from a neighborhood with half college educated and half high school dropouts better, like doing better or worse off than children from a neighborhood with where everyone is a high school graduate, right?
Exactly, yeah, because in a lot of presentation I go to, they kind of, and I understand why they would break it up. You have these two groups and you can compare the high versus the low. But yeah, exactly. But I'm wondering in these communities where, and in England, I remember a while back when I went to visit family and I looked at some of the historical villages, in many cases you did have, although there were people that were clearly affluent, but it did seem to be that communities were centered around a manor or a home where you had like an aristocratic, you know, person, noble person that owned property there, but they were living side by side with villagers. It was a very different community versus here today, you have the professional class that all live in the same area and they all interact with each other. But but my question is communities where they're more mixed in terms of SES, if they're different in some way.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. We haven't looked, and I mean, the data we have, I think we can. So that would be an interesting question to ask. So what would be your prior? Would you think that the kids from the mixed neighborhood do better?
I would, so I'm not absolutely certain. I guess it's not my area, but I would think that if you're exposed to people from different perspectives, I mean, I would think that there's a benefit. I mean, there might be a downfall in some things, but I would think that, for example, I've talked to psychologists that look at how many a child that's growing up, right, over the years, if they're exposed to people from high socioeconomic conditions, they're actually exposed to more words, and they actually count the number of words, the sentences, right? So a poor child interacting with people of different SES backgrounds, of higher ones, would probably be exposed to more language, right? And that's stimulating and they can incorporate that. So just many, you know, I mean, there's many things you can look at, but I would.
But on the other hand, you have social cohesion. So people do better when live in neighborhoods that are socially coherent, more cohesive, because people feel safer and they feel supported, less stress. So it might be, you know, kind of live with people like you, but maybe socialize with people that have better education and more money.
It also depends on the schooling, public school, private school. And then, you know, the segregation is a big thing in the UK.
Right.
Yeah. And here too, I think, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
No, I think those are all great questions. And as I said, I hadn't thought about them before, and I think we should be able to do something along those lines. So thank you. Those are great. Yeah.
So do we have any other questions? We're almost out of time. We have 2 minutes and I know people have things to do. Are there any last questions that maybe a few people want to ask the speaker?
Yes, what are the speaker-like looking appliances? Is this a washing machine?
Oh yes, it is. Sorry. I these days I hide from my kids in my garage. And, I've been hiding
Awesome.
for the last 4 months.
Awesome.
Bikes, we have like scooters, so it's, yeah. Sorry about that.
Maybe we could publish something together.
Yeah, we should talk. Yeah, no, it seems like you guys are.
Oh, it's wonderful. Really, it has been a tremendous window, at least for me, for sure. And I have never, you know, envisioned the genetics of, you know, these things, and to look at.
Of economy.
Yeah, so it's wonderful. Mario,
Yeah, thank you. So I'm glad it's.
so please join us also anytime.